This week, Michael Daniel, President and CEO of Cyber Threat Alliance, is with us for an interview. In the security news for this week, to steal or collect a bug bounty, print bombing an NFL team, WebKit strikes again, hackers beframing, tipsy Linux kernels, is that an AirTag in your pocket, or it was Russia unless it wasn't Russia, Cassandra and Magento, and how not to redact. There will also be a technical segment. I'm going to show you how to run Windows on top of Docker that's running on Linux, which we thought may have been possible. Turns out it is. And I'll show you how to do it. All that and more on this edition of Paul's Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly. For security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. We're proud to announce CSO Stories, a new podcast series in partnership with Cybersecurity Collaborative and Cybersecurity. CSO Stories features the candid perspectives and experiences of frontline senior security executives and dives deep into timely security topics. CSO Stories is hosted by Todd Fitzgerald, VP of Cybersecurity Strategy at Cybersecurity Collaborative, and Sam Curry, Chief Product and Security Officer at Cybersecurity. Listen weekly as they speak with extraordinary CSOs by visiting securityweekly.com/CSP.
And now, the beautiful, amazing Armenian devil, Paul Jean, who doesn't only curse out the liquor store people on the phone, he does so for bougie reasons. Here he is.
Welcome, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. It's episode number 728, recorded on February 16th, 2022, right here in G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island. Although we are all remote on host, Mr. Lee Neely is with us. Welcome, Lee.
Good to be here. Nice to have a change of pace and talk about something other than some of the incredible audits I've been prepping for.
Audits don't sound very fun, Lee.
They're not.
Mr. Josh Marpet is here with us. Josh, welcome.
Why, thank you. Always a pleasure to be here. Love it.
For the second time today, we get to be together.
Yeah, seriously. We did the webcast earlier with Kevin Johnson, and
Yes.
which is recorded and available, I think, on the site yet, or will be shortly.
A little bit of banter in the beginning of that webcast, which
we actually got yelled at by some
we
of the people in
did,
it.
but I mean, it's Paul, Kevin, and Josh. We've known each other for years. We hadn't hung out like that in a while, so it was a little bit of banter. I thought it was good. We eventually got into it, and I thought it was amazing.
It was a good session. It was a really good session. It was fascinating. It was a psychology, technology. It was a nice mixture of all of those things.
Mr. Tyler Robinson is here with us. Tyler, welcome.
Thank you. Sounds like an exciting segment. I mean, anytime you get Kevin on there and then having you two, that just sounds like a good time.
There were some shenanigans in the beginning, yeah. Then we dug into how to validate vulnerabilities in your environment when it's being reported by a third party. So it was good. You should check it out. securityweekly.com/webcasts.
I swear we should probably, the three of us should do a stand-up comedy routine at some point. It's just bad.
We thought we were funny. For more funny webcasts, and hopefully ones that teach you about cybersecurity, we've got on March 2nd, 5 things you can do to catch more bad guys with Doug Burks, CEO over at The Security Onion. Then on March 10th, an introduction to KQL queries, KQL Kung Fu, finding the needle in the haystack in Azure environments. Darwin Salazar will be presenting along with Tyler Robinson. You can register for all the webcasts coming up on Security Weekly at securityweekly.com/webcast. We only ask for name and email for our community webcast series, and we don't share that. We just use that to send you an email afterwards with the materials from the webinar. Alrighty. Michael Daniel currently serves as the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance. Prior coming to the Cyber Threat Alliance in March 2017, Michael served for 4 years as U.S. Cybersecurity Coordinator, leading U.S. cybersecurity policy development, facilitating U.S. government partnerships with the private sector and other nations, and coordinating significant incident response activities. In his spare time, he enjoys running and martial arts. Michael, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
What kind of martial arts you practice, Michael?
called Chishin-ryu Karate-do.
Nice.
So it's a very traditional style of Japanese Okinawan martial arts.
So kind of like Miyagi-Do, because I'm a big fan of the show.
Oh God.
Something like that. Yep.
That's awesome. That's awesome. My kids are very involved now with wrestling. I'm trying to get the youngest into judo, so we'll see how.
Oh yeah, very cool.
How that goes. Michael, you obviously didn't start out in cybersecurity. You have a history of non-cybersecurity, and then I feel like at some point you transitioned and you were a cybersecurity advisor to President Obama in the second term. Tell us how you got there.
Sure. So I actually started out my career in the federal government working in national security. And in fact, my background is in national security and international trade and finance and economics and, sort of that kind of background. And I was overseeing the finances for the U.S. intelligence community in the sort of early 2000s. And of course, at that point, CIA and NSA and some of the other agencies in the U.S. government started spending what we could charitably call boatloads of money on this thing called cyber. And no one really knew what they were spending the money on. And so the OMB director at the time actually looked at me and another guy in the National Security Division and said, "You two, go get smart on this cyber thing." And that sort of started us down this path of really getting interested in cybersecurity. And as the federal government started working more and more and becoming more cognizant of the cyber threats, I started spending more and more of my time working on cybersecurity issues until finally in 2012, the Obama White House asked me to come over and serve on the National Security Council staff as the cybersecurity coordinator.
It's a silly question, Michael, but did you get to go to the Oval Office?
I have been in the Oval Office, yes.
That's such an honor. What was that like?
It's funny to say it, but it's actually the entire West Wing is smaller than you think it is. Because it was a 18th century mansion, right, with an extension built on it. And so all of the offices and everything over in the West Wing are much, much smaller than you think they are. And even the Oval it's big, but it's not, it's not that huge. But it is very daunting to go in there, and you're never quite sure if you've never really been in there, you're not quite sure. Can I sit on this piece of furniture, or is it just decorate Right. So you end up you're trying to follow everybody else's lead and not do anything stupidly crazy or anything.
Yeah. What kind of questions did President Obama or other folks ask you about cybersecurity at the time? Because I'm not imagining that you were briefing cybersecurity experts, right? They're experts in their own fields, relying on you for that expertise.
Yeah. So a lot of what the questions that they're asking are really about the implications of what's happening, right? It's about how do I understand this? How do I put this in context? What can I compare it to? Why is it that you and your staff treat this series of media reports as being very serious and something worth the government expending time on addressing, whereas this series of media reports you basically dismiss as not being credible, even though to a non-expert they look exactly the same? Explain those differences to me. Those are the kinds of questions that we would get. We would also get questions like, okay, so what do we do about it, right? What should be the policy response? What should be the response across the government so that we actually address the problems?
So is that something that we're failing at? Is that maybe an area in cybersecurity that we can actually begin to make a bigger impact, is by addressing or reframing how we're disseminating information to people that are policymakers, that are making big decisions? Are we not providing the impact or the why and then the additional how around things that actually matter to them? Because it seems like there's a big disconnect between what things are happening and what things are getting attention versus what actually matters in our minds and what we're trying to articulate as risk to policy and decision makers.
Yeah, I think I found that a large size chunk of my job was actually translating from the technical side, taking the things that were being talked about in the technical circles and translating those into the language that the policymakers could understand. And the issue is that, they're really super smart people, but they're not deeply embedded in the technical aspects. And so really trying to strip away the unnecessary complexity to get to the heart of the issue, that's what I think our industry could do a better job of really boiling it down to the key decisions that we really need the policymakers to make, and then leave the rest of it, the implementation, to the experts who are going to figure out exactly how to go do that. But you want the broader policy guidance. And I think that's a skill that the industry really needs to develop more. And I think the other piece from my perspective is also broadening the aperture. I mean, in the intro, you were talking about how the conversation that you had earlier today sort of mixed the psychology with technology. And I think that's actually really critical, right? Because these are not really purely technical. Cybersecurity is not really purely a technical discipline. It involves a lot of other kinds of disciplines as well.
I agree, Michael. And actually, in an interview I did earlier that hasn't aired yet, the guest was talking about that, how, I kind of asked him, I believe it was like, other industries are kind of siloed off and not thinking about cyber. And it's actually Win Schwartow said, well, we kind of live in our own silo and don't interact with other areas as much. So it's a two-way street. What was it like to work on the policy side and interact with all those different folks in different roles to try and get them to come together to help protect the nation from cyber attacks?
It was a very challenging environment because you've got people who are looking at it from a Justice Department lens, for example, and they're used to thinking about it in terms of, can we arrest and prosecute these individuals? You've got people who are looking at it from a purely defensive point of view. And even just, to give you an example, like, so you have a major incident that affects a federal agency. And from a law enforcement perspective, right, you want to preserve evidence. That's forensics, right? But from a network operator standpoint, you want to get the network functional again, right? So how do you sort of manage those trade-offs between, preserving evidence and getting an operation back going? So those are the kinds of trade-offs that you're having to make. And you're also, in cybersecurity, again, you're dealing with agencies that are not always used to dealing with the national security space. So, for example, if you're talking about wanting to better protect water systems, the federal agency with the lead in water security and dealing with water systems across the United States is the Environmental Protection Agency. They're the sector lead for that sector. They don't spend a lot of time in national security circles. So even sort of bringing them in and having them understand how that side of the house works, that takes time and investment to bring those agencies together.
And sometimes larger meeting rooms, right?
Yeah, we used to joke that like we couldn't fit in the conference rooms in the old executive office building because we needed so many different agencies to be present that we were often like hunting around for which room can hold us because we would have so many people present at the meeting.
Michael, I want to sort of take a couple of things you've chatted about just now and bring them together. You mentioned that, to relay information to policymakers, to agencies, you've got to strip out the externalities. You've got to strip out the extraneous stuff. You really need to bring it down to a core and make it understandable to them. And I love that. That makes total sense to me. But also on the other side of the equation, the place that we get the information from. Yeah, we know when we had an incident, but when we bring them threat intel, when we bring them, hey, I just found this out, where'd you get it? Well, InfoSec Twitter. Okay, because let's be honest, where do we get most things? InfoSec Twitter, right? We get this from InfoSec Twitter, or in your case, we got it from the NKIC or wherever. But what's the veracity of it? What's the likelihood of it? What's going on? The policymakers, the people on the boards on the commercial side, the appointees on the government side, they don't have the ability or the experience, rather, not the ability, but the experience to understand what that means. And so it really is a psychology. It's a translation. It's a public speaking. There's a lot of things involved there. And then when you start talking about now we've got a business necessity of being back up and running, we've got to do forensics for the law enforcement who are screaming at us, "Don't touch that! Don't touch that!" And yes, that's happened to me. It's a tough battle that we fight. And then I'd like to throw one more thing in the mix: is that there's no mandated reporting for incidents happening in the commercial world, and it gets to be really ugly trying to figure out what's going on.
I think there's one more missing, Josh, right? Like there's also the strategy of our ability to gather intelligence, and you have to work with some of the intelligence agencies to figure out, do we want to kick these actors out? Do we need to gain additional information? Is it a better resource for the offensive side to leverage this to find different TTPs? So you've got an additional sector there that I think people often forget about.
Michael, sorry, did you want to comment there?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. You're always trying to assess, and again, part of that job of the National Security Council staff inside the White House is to provide that perspective, to say, what kind of confidence do we have in this information? How reliable is it? How do we act on it? And all of those things are, they're incredibly challenging. And I think, some of it is also that in other areas, we have many, many, many more years of experience, even among the policy circles, of assessing like what a report on a foreign weapon system means, right? Because the intelligence community has been reporting on, the R&D advances in foreign nation states for, probably centuries, right? And we really don't quite have that level of experience with even the language and the terminology in cyberspace yet.
That's interesting.
Are there folks, and I'm sure still today, like what constitutes a physical response based on a cyber attack? Like, there are people standing up going, we should drone strike. And I mean, the news has reported, and I believe some of those incidents happening, but what goes into those conversations?
Well, a lot of it it's about like, how do you characterize it, right? How do you understand it? And so I'll give you a very concrete example that is now, much more out in the public domain. But if you recall, back in the summer and heading into the fall of 2012, so 10 years ago, the Iranians were conducting DDoS attacks against our financial services institutions, right? And there were some people who would be in the meetings and they would say, well, that's the equivalent of the Iranians have attacked us. And so that's the equivalent of they've sailed a sub up to the East Coast and have disgorged a bunch of special operations guys, and they're blowing stuff up in Delaware. And other people were like,
I'm in Delaware, man. Don't say these things.
I should have said Rhode Island, right? The studios are in Rhode Island, province. My friend Jim Langevin would not like that. Right. So other people in the room were like, no. No, that's the wrong analogy. The Iranians have hired a bunch of teenagers to drive up and down the street and play their radio really loud, right? That's the right analogy.
I'd say it's somewhere in between, maybe.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and it's sort of like...
The Iranians have hired a bunch of teenagers to play mailbox baseball at very large scale, disrupting the postal service from doing their job.
Yeah. I mean, and what you can see by that is it was like people were sort of struggling with like, okay, what's the right analogy? Where are we? How do I think about this issue? And I would say that to this day, that question that you asked, Paul, actually remains undefined. Where would a cyber incident, how serious would it have to be? How disruptive, how destructive? How many people would have to die in order for a cyber incident to translate into a physical response? Normally, when you've seen sort of the drone strike issues, they've usually been in association with terrorist organizations, right, that have been using cyberspace to do recruiting and propaganda and other things. And it's really been part of the broader fabric of the operations against terrorist units, as opposed to sort of being directly in response to that particular cyber operation.
But let's take that analogy. Ransomware has killed people. Period. There's no argument there. Ransomware against healthcare organizations has killed people. Period. Is that an attack?
If we need acquired infrastructure, I mean, we're doing physical things through our allies and partners in Eastern Bloc countries. Maybe not drones.
Sure.
Let's make it an easier question. How about we go back to what we were talking about, Michael? Do you think that mandated reporting of breaches should happen? Let's start there. Let's start on a data collection side. I mean, Cyber Threat Alliance is all about information sharing, right? Should information sharing be mandated? Should breaches be mandated to be reported?
I think they actually should. And I think we very much need better incident data. And I think there should be a requirement to report cyber incidents. Now, I think you need to, obviously, right, we need to define incident, meaning it's actually got to have something bad, like, some sort of negative effect on the organization, some form of their business was interrupted, some piece of, some amount of data was stolen. There was some negative effect, not just that there was something bad detected. Otherwise, we could overwhelm the system. But I definitely think that, that kind of reporting is critical to actually get a better understanding of what's actually happening in the ecosystem.
So how is that sharing happening now? Like, what is driving the people that are working, the working groups working with you, the people that are sharing that information? Like, how does this ecosystem look now, and kind of what is the future goal of that?
So for CTA itself, right, our business model is really about, we work to enable cybersecurity providers to share threat intelligence with each other. So rather than being focused on an industry vertical, we're actually focused on the cybersecurity industry itself, right? And trying to get those companies that are involved in providing cybersecurity products or services to actually share data with each other. And
we can't.
Whether that's
impossible.
Automated.
That's impossible. We're all NDA'd up the yin yang from our clients. How? I'm sorry, you got to explain that.
So here's the thing, which is that what we collect is the underlying technical threat intelligence, not the actual incident reports. So you're absolutely right. We don't get reporting about specific incidents, right? What we get is the technical underlying IOCs and TTPs and other related context that helps identify malicious activity down the road. And even then, you're absolutely right. None of our members share everything they have because they can't. Because they have NDAs, they have contracts, they have legal requirements, whatever. Heck, some of them operate in Europe, and Europe has decided that an IP address is personally identifiable information, right? So so there are many constraints on that, but we try to work through those constraints as much as possible to enable as robust a sharing as we can manage given those constraints.
Are you working with the cyber insurance industry to do that as well?
We do have some preliminary discussions with the cyber insurance industry, and I think that those conversations are only going to accelerate over the next 6 months to a year, as that industry really realizes that if they want to do a good job pricing cybersecurity products, they're actually going to have better data to support the actuarial decisions.
Details.
And most of those, the good insurance ones are doing a really good job at that. The bad ones are doing a really poor job at that. But that information, they tend to have the ability, because everyone needs a policy in order to get through procurement, to do a contract, to make money. And so they're very, very motivated to share whatever information is needed. It's surprising how much information these cybersecurity companies end up with, even around very particular breaches or breach scenarios. I think it's a great place to build a partnership, is that breach scenario, because their clients are already having to provide that information as part of their contractual obligation for an incident. So it seems like a very straightforward place to get integrated.
Michael, I'm just curious, when working with other three-letter agencies, for example, I'm not going to ask you to reveal any national secrets. Don't worry. We had this conversation, right? But when there's an operation being conducted and intelligence is being gathered from whatever agency, even sharing snippets of that, summaries of that, could uncover the operation. So, like, how do you balance that? Like, let's say, I'm not saying, you're not saying this, I'm saying this, NSA has penetrated enemy nation state systems and they're observing things, but they can't really share what they're observing because that would give the enemy the notion that, oh, someone else is in my system. How do you balance that type of information sharing?
Yeah, that's been a long-standing problem in intelligence. Actually, probably going back to the Greeks, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
this way before computers, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's, that's a long-standing problem of how you sort of manage that trade-off, right? Because if you're collecting the intelligence and you don't do anything with it, then why are you collecting it, right? If it's not helping you shape decisions, then why are you collecting it? So there's always that effort to protect those sources and methods while still putting the information to use. And so some of it is, can you strip away the parts that would be identifiable? Can you, in effect, launder the information in some way to make it usable without sort of the attribution to it? But sometimes, or to the source, right? Mm-hmm. But sometimes you're left with all we can do is actually prepare. And we can, work with those that can have a need to know, that can protect the information, and we just have to watch. And that does happen sometimes. And it's a risk trade-off that you make on an ongoing basis in order to actually deal with that intelligence. We call it the intelligence gain loss problem. Mm-hmm. And it's a very, very common one.
Who are the consumers of the information and the threat intelligence that you're gathering and building? How do people actually acquire and disseminate? How are you guys disseminating?
And I think what Tyler was getting at is the exact question I was going to ask. How do you vet who's getting the information, right? Even ISACs, I had to vet to be in a certain ISAC to receive that level of intelligence.
Yeah. So we have an application process that we go through for CTA members, and there's a sort of a long onboarding period where we as we bring a new member on. And so the only people who get access to the CTA intelligence directly are those that are actually members of the alliance. And one of the things about the cybersecurity industry is that it's still not actually all that huge. And so you can almost always find people who know people, right? You don't have to go to the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, right, to get to any given cybersecurity company. It's usually only 2 or 3 hops away. And you can actually start to do some vetting on that entity. But actually part of it is that we also then are very clear about the intelligence you share with CTA through our automated system. Now we have a different channel for human speed finished intelligence products, and I can talk about that if you like. But for our automated sharing, we're very clear that once that goes into our platform, other members are actually going to take it and they're going to do something with it in their products and services. They may not attribute it back to CTA, and they will certainly not attribute it back to any further than they got it from CTA, so they won't attribute it to which other member they got it from. But they're going to take it and put it in their products and services to use it. Because again, the whole point of it is to improve the defenses of the ecosystem as a whole. And so we're very upfront about that. But because it ends up being several layers removed, most of our members are all comfortable with how that model operates.
And is your intelligence coming from both private and public sector?
So it's primarily from private sector companies, although we do have relationships with, for example, the multi-state ISAC. And so we get their distributions of intelligence that come from, mostly state and local governments. We are part of the Department of Homeland Security's CISP program, the Critical Infrastructure Sharing Program. So we do get some of those sources, but the overwhelming majority of what we have is from private sector companies.
Michael, I wanted to talk about, it was interesting, you said the militarization of cyberspace and how people kind of fear that, right? That there are nation states, ours included, again, my words, not Michael's, that conduct operations that we hear about, that no one wants to say that they did it, but there are cyber operations happening, on offensive cyber operations happening. And, I think some of the fears are that, like, well, the governments are going to take over the internet, but that's not really true.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like arguing that because there are navies, the entire, all the oceans of the earth are militarized, or because there are air forces, the airspace of the planet is militarized. And it's just not the case. And I think that to, in fact, expect the opposite, that there would not be military and intelligence forces operating in a domain as big and as important as cyberspace, is a little naive. And that, pretty much from the time that humans could build boats, we built navies, right? And from the time we started building airplanes, we built air forces, right? It's part of how the world seems to work. What I think is a more important discussion is then, how do we want those forces to operate in cyberspace? What are the rules that we're going to put around it? What's the doctrine? How are we going to employ those forces? That's where the real debate should be.
Yeah, how do we protect the critical infrastructure, not just of our nation, but make it so not everyone's turning the lights off on everyone else?
Yeah, that's right. How do we actually ensure that there's some stability to cyberspace, and that it's not just a free fire zone, right? And I think that those are really important public policy questions to wrestle with.
Now, does that also include information? Like, are we talking about the cyberspace and protecting what information is being pushed out to the public, what information is being pushed to media, how policies are directed around platforms, and what information they're disseminating with prejudice? Do all those things come into account as well?
Yeah, and so here's what's really interesting, right, is if you're sort of a student of this area, you know that, like, in the West, we tend to divide things very clearly along we talk about cybersecurity, right? And what we really mean is we can talk about the confidentiality, integrity, and access, availability of information, right? But we don't really talk about the content of that information. We talk about systems and operational systems and their integrity and their ability to carry out operations. But we very clearly divide off that content question. And a lot of other countries, in fact, most other countries, don't really make that distinction. The Russians don't actually talk about internally. They don't talk about cybersecurity. They talk about information security. And for them, that encompasses that content question. Now, from their perspective, they consider dangerous content to be stuff we would call free speech. And so that's an interesting challenge. But definitely dealing with that information domain is an emerging discipline in and of itself. And we are very uncomfortable as Americans with having our government actually involved in that space, right? Because of our longstanding traditions around free speech and how we feel about government activity in that sphere. But yet we're starting to realize that, there is a problem there with misinformation and disinformation. And so how do we deal with that in the information space?
Yeah, and how do we handle vulnerability disclosure at this level, Michael? There's been a lot of incidents, a lot of stuff written about, and just to paraphrase all of that, basically a government, let's say the U.S., finds a vulnerability, weaponizes it. What's their responsibility to tell the vendor, right? It's not like the physical world where we can build weapons, physical weapons, other countries can build physical weapons, right? There's like a third party involved
Yep.
in cyber weapons. How's that handled?
So there's actually something in the U.S. government called the Vulnerabilities Equities Process. And because it's the government, therefore they put an acronym to it. So they call it the VEP. And the idea, though, is if the government, in the process of doing its work, discovers a vulnerability, there's a couple of things that policy actually says. One is it says our default position is that we're going to go disclose that vulnerability to the vendor. And that it's only if an agency can make a credible, reasonable argument that there is a national security or a law enforcement requirement that is compelling enough that you should retain that vulnerability inside the government. That's the only time that you can actually do that. The other piece of that policy says, and that decision to retain that vulnerability is not final. Like, it has to be reviewed on a regular basis to make sure that the situation hasn't changed. And the balance that you're weighing in making that kind of decision is, what's the risk that I'm running? If I don't disclose this vulnerability, what's the likelihood that one of our adversaries will find it as well and begin to exploit it? And if they do, what's the potential damage to the U.S.? What's the likelihood that we'll actually get something from the exploitation of this vulnerability that's actually worthwhile, that would make it worthwhile to run that risk? So and there's actually a very defined process inside the U.S. government for reviewing those vulnerabilities and making a collective decision with all of the relevant parties about how to proceed. And again, it all starts from that foundation of the default position is we have to go disclose. And so it's up to those agencies that want to retain that vulnerability to make the case of why you should do that.
Wait, so was the VET created before or after Eternal Blue? That's a different situation.
So the VEP was created in roughly, actually going back to 2009. So it's been in place in varying forms since about 2011.
I think like previous me would like disagree with the keeping it from the vendor portion of it, but more mature Paul is like there is only a lifespan of that vulnerability. And I spent some time with Casey Ellis and other bug bounty people, and I think what I really gleaned from that is that lifespan is kind of short, right? Like eventually it's going to get out and the vendor is going to fix it. And I think, like you said, Michael, I'm going to be on your side on this one, right? If we can use it in the context of national security for specific objectives, we should during that time, because eventually it's going to get fixed and it's going to be completely worthless and useless. Well, maybe not so much, because people do have to patch. It's going to be a lot less useful.
It'll be a lot less useful. And I know that people have this image that like the U.S. government has this Raiders of the Lost Ark warehouse full of these vulnerabilities. But if you actually, think about it, right, that's kind of ridiculous, because those vulnerabilities have a limited shelf life in terms of them being unknown and unknown to the vendors. And in my mind, I think the advantage of having a defined process like this is that you actually have a process that you can point to, that you can stand behind. And, it's actually something that we've encouraged other countries to adopt, because the nature of intelligence agencies, the nature of law enforcement agencies is they are going to look for these kinds of vulnerabilities to exploit. And so, you want to put in place a process that makes sure that the pros and the cons of doing that are actually appropriately weighed.
I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize how much of that happens in the U.S. government across the board, right? So you served under President Obama. From my understanding, President Obama peeled back a lot of the Patriot Act and shenanigans that were happening there. But I think there's many, certainly listening to this show and in the general public, that are like, the government's evil, they want to spy on us. I think in reality, like there's a process, and folks in the government really, they don't want to look at your personal stuff. They want to defend the nation.
Yeah, and it's, the other thing is there's only 24 hours in the day, right? And they've got a job to do, which is, actually protecting the U.S. and protecting U.S. citizens. Now, I lived in Washington now for most of my life, actually, and I would never be one to argue that there's never abuses, right? There are abuses, and there are occasions when the rules are violated. But those are the exceptions to the rule. And the people that I have dealt with in the intelligence community and the Defense Department and others, they are, overwhelmingly, they are mission driven. And that phrase gets thrown around a lot, but they really are. They're driven to, protect the country, protect people. And, the vast majority of them operate with great integrity about what they do. And there's always these tensions in the government, and they're often quite vocal and loud arguments because people are so passionate about what they do and about bringing what they're trying to achieve to about what they're trying to achieve. And so that's part of what makes, managing sort of the interagency, disagreements so tough.
Who was the director of NSA when you were serving President Obama?
So for most of the time, it was General Keith Alexander. About towards the end of my time there, he had retired and Admiral Mike Rogers had taken over.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, and I'm sure if Jeff Mann was here, he'd be able to tell us about all the different people in charge of the NSA at these various times. But yeah, we're familiar with Alexander and Rogers very well.
Yes.
Yep.
So quick question. We've got a few minutes left. At the Cyber Threat Alliance, what would be your biggest goal for the next few years? If you could hit something, what would it be that would make you go, yeah, we did awesome stuff?
Yeah, I think for me, it's really starting to answer the question, how do you put shared intelligence to work to achieve operational effects, right? So what I mean is, how do we actually use the shared intelligence that CTA has to support actions that actually impose costs on the bad guys, while still using it to raise the resilience and the defenses of our critical infrastructure and our small and medium businesses and all the way across the board of the ecosystem. But how do we use it to actually enable disruption of the bad guys, so that we throw sand in their gears, make it more expensive for them to do what it is that they're doing, make it a less lucrative business if you're a cyber criminal, make them spend more time and money if they're a nation state. That's really the goal that I have, of really sort of enabling that shared threat intelligence to really be a force multiplier in what we do against the adversaries.
I feel like cryptocurrency has made that super hard too. We got our work cut out for us.
Oh yeah, I mean, cryptocurrency is like the fuel of ransomware, right? I mean, if you think back to what did the criminals do prior to cryptocurrencies? Can you imagine? Like, would you please send me $10 million in Starbucks gift cards?
Yeah, there was shady stuff happening. It was easier to trace back and kind of control, but now it's super hard. But I agree with you, Michael, in that we need to have. It's the actionable intelligence, and it's the action part that's the most important. I think I said this last week too. I worked in vulnerability management, and we made software that found a whole bunch of vulnerabilities. But how many times I have the conversation of like, yeah, we can't fix all those because we can't get the right information to the right people. The problem isn't about information collection; it's about taking the action. That's why I'm somewhat critical of the current administration. Well, I think it's good they're promoting information sharing in all the executive orders and things that I've read. It's very heavy on promoting that information sharing. But what about actions and repercussions, right? You touched on that as well. How do we make it so people actually do something? That's the hard part.
Yeah, it is very much the hard part. And I can say this as someone who, spends his time, making information sharing work. It's a lot harder than the actual sharing, right? The collection, that's easier, but then the sharing is hard, but then actually making it operational, that's even harder. And I think that, that's where we really have to put the time and effort, is to figuring out how to actually bring that information together in a way that enables us to take, make better targeting, make where we're putting our time and effort have the greatest return on the investment.
I guess my question is, how could we use regulation to make it so that people are compelled, maybe forced, right, to take some of those actions? And that's a slippery slope.
It is, but I think that there's actually an emerging standard of care, right? And I use that term very deliberately. Like, what we've been struggling with in a lot of cybersecurity for a long time is there's been this argument that the technology moves so fast that you can't really regulate it at all. And I think that's actually incorrect. Like, we are starting to know some of the practices and things that really aren't going to change anytime soon, right? Like, I don't think any of us expect, like, you know what, it's okay, go back to your flat network, that's fine, right? Sure, passwords by themselves, that great. We know that things like multi-factor authentication and segmentation, right, using complex passwords with a password manager, these are practices that aren't going to change in the near term. And so I think we can start to move towards saying, look, just like if you run a business, and just like you've got to comply with generally accepted accounting principles for maintaining your books, just like you have to meet certain standards of physical security or physical safety in your workplace, you're going to have to meet certain cybersecurity standards. Now, that's going to be different if you're JP Morgan Chase or you're Duke Energy compared to Flo's Flower Shop down the street, right? So it's not going to be the same thing in every industry or the same thing for every size of company. But I do think that we can start moving in the direction of saying there are some cybersecurity standards that you are really going to have to meet because it's part of operating a business, just like you have to meet accounting principles and demonstrate that your books are clean.
And I think something that could really help that is having the providers provide services that meet those standards, right? Having helped out a small business as an example, like, why can't a smaller business go get an Office 365 account? And these like basic security things are there. They don't have to go configure them, but they're there. And it might seem slightly inconvenient to like not having them, but it also makes you compliant to these safety standards. And maybe there's some incentive, right? I'm not a big fan of the stick, but some incentive, positive reinforcement.
Yeah, absolutely. And like when you think, there's numerous analogies that I use in this space, right? Like, we need to make it as simple for the end user as possible, right? And most of those settings need to be done by default. And we need to pretty much, have it set up. You're absolutely right, Paul. It should be provided with the right security in place by default. When you get in the car, right? What do we ask drivers to do? We say, put on your seatbelt and like don't text and pay attention to the road. Your car doesn't ask you, should I turn on the anti-lock brakes now? Yes, no. Right? You don't have to configure your car every time you get into it. To actually have the safety features work, right? Those all work by default. And we need to move much more into that mindset of that for the vast majority of organizations, the security settings and things can be, comes out of the box. It comes that way. Now, if you're a security professional, right, then you have the option. You can go in there and start tinkering, just like if if you are so inclined, you can go and tinker with your car. But the vast majority of people won't bother with that.
Right. And what I think is interesting in this analogy, Michael, that I think is kind of funny to think about is, remember the seatbelts used to automatically go over, and they removed them because I think it just annoyed people, right? So I think there's a line there too that we have to be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you can't do it stupidly, right? Because if it interferes with their ability to do business, right, really interferes with the ability to do business, then they'll work around it.
Right.
And so you are right that there has to be that line, but I definitely think there's a lot of those practices we could easily put in place, and people would not even blink an eye at it at this point.
Yeah, that inconvenience of MFA. I mean, no comparison to the inconvenience of paper straws. Those are terrible.
Oh, stop.
Yeah, those paper straws are like a travesty against humanity. Like,
it's useless. Yeah. It's terrible. But it's for safety of the environment is the reasoning, behind that. Whether, how much we believe that or whatever, right? We could talk about that maybe on a different show, but I think there's some of the inconvenience. There's this misconception and misperception about the inconvenience. Like having two-factor on everything, like I have, like you get used to it, and it's fine, right? Just like we got used to the seatbelts. If you're old, like me and some of us on the show, you remember when your car didn't remind you to put your seatbelt on, right? And that got more annoying. And then you remember the automatic seatbelts, right?
Yep.
And things like that. Now newer cars, even like the back seat, you get notifications if it senses weight on the seat up to a certain amount, or there's a certain amount with a threshold, it'll notify that someone doesn't have their seatbelt on in the car, right? Security and convenience.
And I think that's very much where we're having to go, right? The other analogy you can use, right, is we know, and this gets back to the psychology discussion, right? We know that, for example, with retirement systems, right? If you set up your retirement system where your employees have to opt in any sort of reasonable sized company, you will probably get about a 50% take rate on whatever the retirement system is, 401k. If you set it up so that your employees are automatically enrolled when they join and they can opt out, you'll get about a 96% take rate for that retirement plan. And the difference is that it's people go with whatever the default position is and whatever is easier.
Yeah.
And so we need to make cybersecurity much more that default position where you actually have to work to be insecure.
Right, rather than the other way around.
People won't bother.
Yeah, I mean, this works when we talk about cyber. I mean, back in the day, I put a Linux box on the internet in its default configuration. It was horrible. I mean, it would get owned like instantly, and slowly they peeled a lot of that stuff back, and we've even seen more recent examples of that, as well. That security by default is effective. Any more questions for Michael?
Really good stuff. Thank you, Michael.
And you're quite welcome.
So, Michael, did you found the organization, the Cyber Threat Alliance?
So, no, I did not directly found it. I am the first president and CEO, but the member companies, the four sort of founding members had already decided to move forward with it, and they recruited me as I was coming out of government at the end of the Obama administration to kind of be the first president of the organization.
And so to become a member, are there fees? Is that how it's funded?
Yeah, that's how we run on we're like a membership association. So you pay an annual membership fee and you can become part of the alliance. And we're very much focused on anybody any company that is a cybersecurity provider, whether you're a vendor or an MSP or a platform, but if you're providing cybersecurity services to others, we are very much interested in having you as a member.
That's all. So, cybersecurity vendors, companies, everyone's welcome.
Yep, that's right.
Fantastic. Michael, I just have 5 questions for you. 5 silly questions. You ready to play 5 questions with Security Weekly?
Absolutely.
3 words to describe yourself.
Let's see. Meticulous. Meticulous is definitely one. Cautious probably is another one, and active.
If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
Probably a Joe staff.
If you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
That's a good one. Probably He Kept Going.
What is your favorite hacker movie?
Oh, Sneakers.
Choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
I'm showing my age. Yes, I know.
No, so we have a running joke with one of the other hosts who's not here. My favorite movie is Hackers. His is Sneakers. So we kind of like at this informal pool of whatever the guest says, if they choose one of those 2 movies, right? There's others, obviously. Michael, choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
Living dead,
Tommy
fictional,
Jones.
or...
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, so go ahead, Josh.
Living dead, fictional, or otherwise.
Yeah, so I would say, let's see, Tommy Lee Jones would be one, and then probably Liv Tyler.
Outstanding. Michael, thank you so much for appearing on Paul Security Weekly.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
With that, we'll take a short break, come back with our technical segment. Run Windows and Docker on Linux. Coming up next.